US and EU trade in steel and aluminum. The origins of the dramatic escalation in tariffs, specifically the Trump administration's 200% tariff threat on European liquor, can be traced back to trade tensions that began in 2018. Initially, these tensions centered on the steel and aluminum industries, where both the US and the EU have strong production capabilities. As shown in the table above, steel and aluminum are critical commodities that have long been traded between the US and the EU, though tariff rates for these metals were relatively low prior to 2018, 2 to 6% on average. During President Trump's first term, significant changes to US-EU trade policies unfolded, beginning in March 2018. The US imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from the European Union under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, citing national security concerns. This move was part of a broader strategy to bolster domestic industries by reducing the US reliance on foreign metals, which were seen as jeopardizing both economic and defense interests. In response, the European Union retaliated with tariffs on a range of US goods, including motorcycles, agricultural products, and notably, American whiskey. These retaliatory measures further strained trade relations between the two regions and set the stage for the intensifying tariff conflict. The escalation of these tariffs, beginning in 2018, laid the groundwork for the more recent tariff battles during Trump's second term. While initially focused on metals, the expanding trade dispute eventually involved other sectors, including alcoholic beverages, most prominently American whiskey. The whiskey tariffs became emblematic of the broader US-EU tensions, highlighting the intersection of trade protectionism and global trade negotiations. Both the United States and the European Union are major producers of steel and aluminum, but each region has distinct strengths in terms of the types of metals they produce. The US primarily focuses on large-scale, cost-effective production of steel and aluminum, which benefits from the country's abundant natural resources and established industrial infrastructure. This allows the US to produce metals at a competitive price, particularly in bulk quantities for industries such as construction, automotive, and general manufacturing. The EU, on the other hand, is known for its specialization in high-quality, advanced materials, particularly in specialty steels and aluminum alloys. These products are often used in highly technical fields such as aerospace, automotive engineering, medical devices, and precision manufacturing. European manufacturers excel in producing metals with specific qualities, such as superior strength, corrosion resistance, or lightweight properties. This divergence in specialization highlights why, despite both the US and the EU having strong domestic steel and aluminum industries, trade between the two regions remains essential. Both countries rely on each other to meet specialized demands that their own production cannot always satisfy. The specialized products produced by the EU, such as advanced aluminum alloys used in aerospace or high-strength steels for automotive manufacturing, became key points of contention when the US imposed tariffs on European steel and aluminum. The US argued that the EU's competitive edge in these high-tech materials posed a challenge to US industries, particularly with the rise of emerging sectors like electric vehicles, EVs, which require specialized lightweight materials. The imposition of tariffs, including the potential 200% tariffs on European goods, was partly a response to these perceived challenges, as the US sought to protect its domestic industries from what it viewed as unfair competition. This shift to protectionism was also influenced by the growing importance of technological and niche markets where both regions specialized, markets where access to specific materials could determine future global competitiveness. Certain industries require specific grades and characteristics of steel and aluminum that are not easily replicated by domestic producers. For instance, US manufacturers may need European aluminum alloys with unique properties for use in high-performance industries like aerospace and electronics. Similarly, EU producers may require high-strength, cost-effective steel from the US for large-scale projects in construction or heavy machinery manufacturing. The 200% tariff threat underscored the deepening trade rift and demonstrated how the tariffs were not only about basic steel and aluminum but also about the advanced, specialized materials crucial for high-tech industries. This specialization is not limited to just steel and aluminum. It extends to the highly technical and often niche markets where the exact technical specifications of materials are critical to the success of manufacturing processes. Thus, even with strong domestic production capabilities, Both the US and the EU continue to trade these metals to fill gaps in specialized material needs. However, the tariffs posed a significant risk of disrupting these established supply chains, especially in industries like aerospace, medical devices, and renewable energy that rely on these specific materials. In today's global economy, manufacturing supply chains are intricately woven across regions, making them highly interconnected. Even nations with strong domestic steel and aluminum industries often rely on imports of specialized materials to fulfill the precise needs of their manufacturers. Automotive and aerospace. U.S. manufacturers, particularly in the aerospace sector, often require specific European aluminum alloys that offer unique properties, such as higher strength-to-weight ratios, which are crucial for aircraft production. These materials may not be readily available from U.S. producers due to the specialized nature of the alloys. Construction and infrastructure. Certain European steel grades used in high-rise buildings or bridges have characteristics that U.S. builders prefer, such as better tensile strength or resistance to corrosion. These specialized qualities make it difficult for U.S. manufacturers to replace them with domestic alternatives. Electronics and high-tech industries. The EU also supplies advanced materials, such as high-purity aluminum and specialized alloys, which are essential for the semiconductor industry and medical devices. These materials often meet specific technical standards that U.S. manufacturers cannot always replicate locally. These examples show how trade remains essential between the US and the EU despite both countries having capable domestic industries. Each region fills specific gaps in material needs, driven by the demand for specialized products in various sectors. Diversification and risk management. Strategic sourcing is a key practice for companies that want to mitigate risks and ensure a steady supply of materials. By sourcing metals from multiple regions, manufacturers can diversify their supply chains, reducing exposure to risks such as supply disruptions. Events such as factory shutdowns, political instability, or natural disasters, e.g., a hurricane or earthquake, can severely disrupt domestic production. By relying on multiple suppliers across different regions, companies can safeguard their supply chains and reduce the likelihood of major disruptions. Price volatility. The prices of raw materials like steel and aluminum can fluctuate due to changes in global supply and demand, geopolitical factors, or currency exchange rates. Companies that strategically import from various regions can take advantage of price differences, ensuring they are not at the mercy of any single supplier or market condition. Quality assurance. Some manufacturers prioritize suppliers known for consistent quality and reliability. Even if a domestic alternative is available, manufacturers may continue to source from specific regions to maintain the high standards required for their products. For example, in high-end electronics or aerospace industries, the consistency and precision of the material quality can be a critical factor in production success. Impact of tariffs and trade restrictions. This interconnected trade system means that the imposition of tariffs or trade restrictions can have far-reaching consequences. When barriers are placed on materials, industries that rely on seamless global supply chains are disrupted, leading to potential delays, increased costs, and, in some cases, production slowdowns. For example, the U.S. tariffs on European steel and aluminum imposed in 2018 created significant ripple effects across various sectors, increasing the cost of goods in industries such as construction, automotive manufacturing, and aerospace. 200% tariff threats. The potential for extreme tariffs, such as the 200% tariffs threatened by President Trump, only exacerbated these issues. If such high tariffs had been implemented, industries relying on European metals would have faced even steeper price increases, further disrupting global supply chains. For instance, U.S. automakers, aerospace manufacturers, and even industries dependent on specialized aluminum alloys would have seen significant cost hikes, which could have negatively affected their global competitiveness. Supply chain disruption. Such extreme tariffs would not only raise the price of the raw materials themselves but also impact industries across the supply chain. For example, the increased costs would likely lead to delays in production, particularly in sectors that require precise, high-quality materials. This would affect not just the manufacturers of steel and aluminum but also those who depend on these materials to create finished products, from cars to electronics. Consumer impact. When trade restrictions occur, the additional costs typically get passed down the supply chain. This affects not only producers but also consumers, who may face higher prices for finished products such as cars, buildings, and electronics. The risk of 200% tariffs would have amplified this burden, leading to inflated consumer prices and potentially reduced access to critical products that rely on European metal. Before President Trump's tariff escalation in 2018, both the US and the EU maintained relatively low tariff rates on steel and aluminum imports, generally ranging from 2% to 6% depending on the specific product. These tariff rates were seen as modest and did not significantly disrupt trade flows between the two regions. This relatively low-cost trading environment created an atmosphere of stability and predictability, benefiting industries that rely on steel and aluminum products. For example, US manufacturers of automobiles and machinery were able to source materials from the EU at competitive prices, while European industries, particularly in high-tech sectors like aerospace and electronics, could obtain US steel and aluminum products at a reasonable cost. The lower tariff rates allowed businesses on both sides of the Atlantic to engage in mutually beneficial exchanges of goods, fostering a cooperative economic relationship and facilitating the smooth operation of global supply chains. The 2–6% tariff range was considered acceptable by most industries and did not create significant barriers to trade, making the steel and aluminum markets between the US and EU efficient and interconnected. Stable trade relations. Before the tariff increase, US-EU trade relations in steel and aluminum were generally stable and predictable. With tariffs kept at modest levels, companies could plan their supply chains and manufacturing processes with a reasonable level of certainty, minimizing the risk of sudden price hikes or supply shortages. This stability allowed industries in both regions to optimize production schedules, negotiate long-term contracts, and engage in strategic sourcing without significant cost penalties. The low tariffs also encouraged a steady flow of steel and aluminum between the US and the EU, contributing to the overall efficiency of global supply chains. Businesses could rely on the consistent availability of materials, which in turn facilitated long-term planning and investment. For example, the construction of high-rise buildings in the US might depend on European steel, while US companies involved in the aerospace sector could source high-quality aluminum from the EU without facing severe cost fluctuations. This environment of low tariffs and stable trade helped establish the US and EU as key trade partners in the steel and aluminum sectors, allowing both regions to benefit from each other's strengths and capacities. The absence of high trade barriers also meant that both sides could focus more on technological advancements and efficiency improvements rather than navigating complex tariff structures. The 200% tariff threat. Before President Trump's 2018 tariffs, trade relations were marked by the relatively low tariffs on steel and aluminum, but the 200% tariffs threatened by the administration signaled an abrupt shift. The US had considered such drastic measures as part of its broader, America First, strategy to address what it perceived as unfair trade practices by major allies, including the EU. Had the 200% tariffs been implemented, the impact on US-EU trade would have been severe. Not only would it have sharply escalated the cost of European steel and aluminum for US manufacturers, but it would have also led to potential retaliatory tariffs from the EU, further disrupting supply chains. The high tariff threat disrupted the stable trading environment that had characterized US-EU relations, and companies operating in industries dependent on these materials faced significant uncertainty. It would have placed US manufacturers in a difficult position, as they would have faced skyrocketing costs, particularly for specialized European alloys crucial for sectors like aerospace and high-tech manufacturing. US tariff on imports from the EU, June 1, 2018. In June 2018, the United States, under President Donald Trump, implemented significant tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from the European Union. These tariffs marked a dramatic shift from the previous period of relatively low tariff rates and were seen as a response to concerns over national security and the US trade deficit. Steel tariff. June 1, 2018, the US imposed a 25% tariff on imported steel from the European Union, which represented a sharp increase compared to the 2–6% tariffs in place prior to 2018. The justification for this tariff was based on the US administration's argument that steel imports posed a threat to national security, specifically in terms of weakening the domestic steel industry and its ability to meet the needs of the US military and infrastructure projects. This national security justification was made under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which allowed the president to impose tariffs on imports deemed harmful to U.S. national security. The national security rationale for imposing these tariffs was central to the Trump administration's decision. Under Section 232, the U.S. government asserted that steel and aluminum imports jeopardized the country's military and industrial capabilities by undercutting domestic production. This allowed the U.S. to implement the tariffs without relying on international trade bodies like the World Trade Organization, WTO, for approval, a key shift from traditional trade practices. The move was particularly controversial given that the EU is a key ally of the U.S., and such a tariff impacted not only the steel industry but also several downstream industries that rely on these imports. The U.S. steel and aluminum industries were seen as essential for military readiness and the country's economic infrastructure. In addition to the steel tariff, a 10% tariff was imposed on aluminum imports from the EU, which also marked a sharp increase from previous tariff levels. Similar to steel, the U.S. government cited national security concerns as the primary reason behind the decision to impose these tariffs. The administration argued that imports of aluminum, especially from countries with overproduction, were undermining the competitiveness of U.S. aluminum manufacturers. Additional info. This tariff was part of a broader protectionist trade strategy aimed at reasserting U.S. control over its industrial base and reducing reliance on foreign suppliers. The administration also sought to pressure the EU and other trade partners to make concessions on broader issues, such as defense spending and subsidies to companies like Airbus. The aluminum tariffs also had far-reaching effects, as the U.S. is heavily reliant on imported aluminum for manufacturing industries such as automotive, aerospace, and packaging. The tariffs were therefore felt across a wide range of sectors, not just the aluminum production industry. Overall impact. The tariffs imposed on steel and aluminum imports from the EU represented a significant escalation in trade tensions between the two economic blocs. While these measures were framed as necessary for protecting U.S. national security, they were also seen as part of a broader, America First, strategy aimed at reducing trade imbalances and reshaping global trade rules. Additional info. The 200% tariff threat on European liquor, particularly whiskey, emerged as part of a broader political strategy. The U.S. administration used this tariff threat as a bargaining chip in negotiations with the EU, hoping to extract concessions on trade rules, defense spending, and issues like the subsidies received by European industries. The 200% tariff on whiskey was never implemented but served as a symbolic tool to escalate tensions and signal that trade relations would be contingent on the EU's willingness to negotiate across multiple trade fronts. In response to the U.S. tariffs, the EU imposed retaliatory tariffs on a variety of U.S. products, including American whiskey, motorcycles, and jeans, among others. This trade dispute set the stage for ongoing tensions between the U.S. and the EU, impacting broader trade relations. The tariff war continued to have repercussions across various sectors, including manufacturing, agriculture, and consumer goods. U.S.-EU tariff dispute and retaliatory measures, 2018. In 2018, President Donald Trump's administration implemented tariffs on European steel and aluminum imports under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which grants the president authority to impose tariffs on imports deemed a threat to national security. The U.S. government justified these tariffs by arguing that foreign steel and aluminum imports were harming American manufacturing, particularly industries essential for national security, such as defense and infrastructure. Additionally, these tariffs were part of President Trump's broader, America First, trade policy, aiming to reduce the U.S. trade deficit and promote domestic production. However, these tariffs resulted in significant tensions with the European Union, a key trading partner of the U.S. The EU contended that the U.S. tariffs were unjustified under national security grounds, given that steel and aluminum imports were crucial for European industries. As a result, the EU decided to retaliate with tariffs on a range of U.S. products. EU retaliatory tariffs. In retaliation for the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum, the European Union imposed its own set of tariffs on U.S. goods, which included iconic products like American whiskey. Starting in 2018, the EU levied a 25% tariff on U.S. whiskey exports, severely impacting the American whiskey industry, particularly distilleries in Kentucky and Tennessee. Along with whiskey, the EU also targeted motorcycles, jeans, and various agricultural products such as peanuts, citrus fruits, and corn. These tariffs were aimed at sectors in the U.S. economy that had strong political influence, such as the whiskey industry in Kentucky and motorcycle manufacturers like Harley-Davidson. Broader economic and political context, the tariff dispute formed part of a larger US-EU trade conflict, one of the most significant international trade issues during President Trump's first term. It was not solely about steel and aluminum, it was a broader disagreement over the future of global trade, with the US challenging long-standing trade agreements and institutions like the World Trade Organization, WTO. The EU's retaliatory tariffs were strategically aimed at targeting politically sensitive industries in US swing states, such as whiskey-producing regions and key manufacturing hubs in the Midwest. This was an effort to pressure the US into backing down on its metal tariffs, while also sending a message about the costs of unilateral trade actions. Impact on US-EU relations and beyond. The US and EU tariff dispute had several economic and political consequences. Trade distortion. Industries reliant on steel and aluminum, such as automotive and construction, faced higher costs. This impacted both US and European companies involved in these sectors. Diplomatic tensions. The tariff impositions strained diplomatic relations between the US and the EU, with each side accusing the other of unfair trade practices. Negotiation dynamics. The EU used these retaliatory tariffs as leverage in trade negotiations, hoping to push the US toward lifting or reducing the tariffs. However, this conflict highlighted the broader challenges of multilateral trade relationships under the Trump administration. EU retaliatory tariffs on American whiskey. The 25% EU tariff on US whiskey exports, in response to the US steel and aluminum tariffs, was one of the most notable and impactful retaliatory measures. American whiskey, particularly bourbon, has long been a significant export to the European market. The imposition of the tariff made US whiskey much more expensive in Europe, leading to a substantial decline in sales. Between 2018 and 2021, US whiskey exports to the EU dropped by approximately 37%. This decline in exports had serious consequences for whiskey producers, especially in Kentucky and Tennessee, which are home to some of the largest distilleries in the world. Economic impact on US whiskey exports. The EU has been one of the largest markets for American whiskey, particularly for bourbon and Tennessee whiskey. With the introduction of the 25% tariff, US whiskey became significantly more expensive in European markets, hurting sales. Kentucky alone accounts for over 95% of the world's bourbon production, making it a central pillar of the state's economy, which depends heavily on whiskey production for jobs, tax revenues, and agricultural support, especially corn production. Tennessee, home to the famous Jack Daniel's distillery, also saw considerable losses due to the tariff. Impact on employment and local economies. The retaliatory tariffs caused both direct and indirect job losses in whiskey-producing regions. Distilleries in Kentucky and Tennessee experienced a drop in revenue due to reduced exports, leading to production cuts and layoffs. Corn farmers, who supply grain to distilleries, also faced economic hardship due to decreased demand. Additionally, the whiskey tourism industry, which attracts visitors to distilleries for tours, festivals, and events, suffered as fewer European tourists visited due to higher whiskey prices. Long-term effects and recovery. Despite these setbacks, American whiskey producers have sought ways to recover, focusing on expanding into other international markets and diversifying their product offerings. Industry groups, including the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, DISCUS, have advocated for the removal of the tariffs, stressing the importance of global markets for the U.S. whiskey industry. By mid-2021, the Biden administration succeeded in negotiating with the EU to suspend the 25% tariff for a period, allowing for some recovery in whiskey exports to Europe. However, uncertainties about future trade policies remain, and the whiskey industry continues to face challenges posed by international tariffs and shifting US-EU tariff timeline and impact on whiskey exports, 2017 to 2021. By the time President Joe Biden took office in January 2021, the retaliatory tariffs imposed by the European Union, EU, on US whiskey had already caused significant damage to American whiskey exports. The 25% tariff, implemented in 2018 as part of the EU's response to US steel and aluminum tariffs, had a profound impact on the whiskey industry, particularly for distillers in key whiskey-producing states like Kentucky and Tennessee. Timeline of events. 2018. The EU imposes a 25% tariff on U.S. whiskey as part of a retaliatory response to the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. This marked the beginning of a period of trade disruption that would severely affect U.S. whiskey exports to the EU. 2018 to 2021, U.S. whiskey exports to the EU dropped by approximately 37% over this period. This sharp decline in sales hit distilleries hard, particularly in Kentucky, where over 95% of the world's bourbon is produced. The decline in export volumes caused significant financial strain on producers who had relied on Europe as one of their most important markets. 2021. With the Biden administration in office, efforts were made to resolve the dispute. By mid-2021, the US and the EU reached an agreement to suspend the 25% tariff temporarily, allowing for some recovery in whiskey exports. However, the long-term effects of the tariffs continued to affect the industry's global competitiveness. Impact on U.S. whiskey exports. The 25% tariff placed on American whiskey made it significantly more expensive for European consumers, which led to a sharp decline in sales. Between 2018 and 2021, whiskey exports to the EU were reduced by 37%, with Kentucky and Tennessee experiencing the most severe losses. The impact was particularly pronounced for bourbon and Tennessee whiskey, which are globally recognized and highly sought after in European markets. The decrease in exports translated to financial strain on distillers. The drop in sales placed immense financial pressure on distilleries, forcing many to cut back on production, reduce staff, or delay planned expansions. Job losses. In addition to distillery workers, jobs in related sectors such as transportation, packaging, and agriculture, especially corn farming, were also at risk. The whiskey industry was a significant source of employment in Kentucky and Tennessee, and these tariffs disrupted that economic ecosystem. Adaptations in alternative markets. In response to the ongoing tariff dispute, U.S. whiskey producers took several steps to mitigate the damage. Shift to domestic markets. Many distillers focused more on the domestic market, seeking to increase sales within the U.S. to make up for the lost European revenue. While this helped some producers, the domestic market alone could not fully compensate for the lost international sales. Exploring alternative export markets, U.S. whiskey producers turned their attention to other growing markets outside the EU. Asia and Latin America became increasingly important export destinations for American whiskey. Countries like China, Canada, and Mexico were targeted as potential areas for growth, although these markets did not fully match the volume of exports to the EU. Brand diversification. Some distilleries diversified their product lines or experimented with premium, limited edition releases that could be marketed to high-end consumers in both domestic and international markets. This strategy allowed distillers to maintain some revenue despite reduced volumes. Financial strain and long-term consequences. The financial toll on the industry was significant. Many distilleries, particularly smaller ones, faced challenges in maintaining profitability during the period of tariffs. Some producers had to raise prices domestically to offset the losses from the European market, while others scaled back operations or laid off workers. Impact on agricultural suppliers. The whiskey industry's reliance on corn farmers in Kentucky and Tennessee meant that the tariffs indirectly affected agricultural supply chains. Reduced demand for whiskey led to fewer orders for grain, harming local farmers who were already dealing with the broader challenges of the agricultural economy. Tourism and local economies. The tourism sector in whiskey-producing regions, including distillery tours, whiskey festivals, and related activities, also saw a decline. European tourists, who were significant consumers of American whiskey, reduced their visits due to the higher prices of whiskey in Europe. This led to reduced consumer spending in local economies that relied on whiskey-related tourism. Recovery efforts and future outlook. Despite the significant challenges posed by the EU tariffs, the whiskey industry began to recover in 2021 after the US and EU agreed to suspend the tariffs temporarily. This suspension provided some relief for producers, and whiskey exports to Europe showed signs of improving. However, many distillers remain cautious about the future, as the possibility of reinstating the tariffs or introducing new trade barriers remains a concern. Advocacy for tariff removal. The Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, DISCUS, and other industry groups have continued to advocate for permanent relief from the tariffs, emphasizing the importance of international trade for U.S. whiskey producers. They argue that a stable, predictable trading environment is essential for the long-term success of the industry. Continued focus on global expansion. U.S. whiskey producers are likely to continue focusing on expanding into other markets, especially in Asia and Latin America, to diversify their customer base and reduce dependence. U.S.-EU tariff developments and impact on whiskey exports, 2021 to 2025. Context and impact after 2021. June 2021. Under President Biden's administration, the EU's 25% tariff on U.S. whiskey was temporarily suspended. While the U.S. metal tariffs remained in place, the suspension of the whiskey tariff gave U.S. whiskey producers hope for recovery. The industry began to see a potential increase in exports to the EU. Late 2021. The suspension of the whiskey tariff continued as the U.S. and EU worked toward a more permanent resolution to the trade disputes. U.S. whiskey exports to the EU began to show signs of growth, signaling a positive shift in trade relations. 2022. With no reinstatement of the whiskey tariff, the U.S. introduced a quota system for EU steel and aluminum imports, shifting from outright tariffs to a more regulated system. This reduction in trade barriers between the U.S. and the EU allowed whiskey exports to rise significantly. 2023-2024. As the whiskey tariffs remained suspended, U.S. whiskey regained its strong presence in the EU market, signaling the success of tariff relief and improving trade relations. 2025. Trump re-elected. The policy landscape became uncertain under a possible second Trump administration, as reports suggested that metal tariffs could be reinstated. This raised concerns within the whiskey industry, which feared potential retaliatory tariffs from the EU, leading to potential instability in trade relations. Impact of 2021 U.S.-EU trade negotiations on whiskey exports. In June 2021, the Biden administration took a significant step toward easing trade tensions with the European Union, EU. Recognizing the negative economic impact on the U.S. whiskey industry and the broader trade relationship, the Biden administration negotiated an agreement with the EU to suspend the 25% tariff on American whiskey. This agreement was part of a broader trade deal that effectively paused the trade war over steel and aluminum, enabling both sides to enter into negotiations for a more long-term resolution to their trade disputes. The suspension of the whiskey tariff was widely celebrated by U.S. whiskey producers and industry groups, including the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, DISCUS, which had long advocated for the elimination of these retaliatory tariffs. The decision to suspend the tariff provided American distillers with a renewed sense of optimism, as it gave them access to one of their largest international markets, the European Union. As a direct result of this tariff suspension, American whiskey exports to the EU began to recover, signaling the restoration of market access that had been severely impacted by the tariffs. U.S. distillers, particularly in whiskey-producing states like Kentucky and Tennessee, were able to regain their footing in the European market, which had seen a dramatic decline in whiskey exports due to renewed trade tensions and future outlook. 2025. The role of the tariff suspension, 2021 to 2025. The suspension of the EU's 25% tariff on U.S. whiskey from June 2021 through early 2025 played a pivotal role in the recovery of American whiskey exports to Europe. During this period, U.S. distillers, especially those in Kentucky and Tennessee, regained access to a market that had previously been severely impacted by the tariff escalation. The absence of punitive tariffs allowed whiskey producers to recover some of their lost market share. especially in key EU markets like the UK, Germany, and France. Between mid-2021 and early 2025, American whiskey exports to the EU increased steadily, offering a much-needed boost to local economies and employment in whiskey-producing regions. This period of tariff relief marked a positive phase in trade relations between the US and the EU, where distillers were able to capitalize on the renewed market access and increase their sales in Europe. The economic recovery fostered by the tariff suspension helped restore some sense of stability and optimism in the whiskey industry. The geopolitical shift, re-election of President Donald Trump, 2025. However, the political landscape took a significant turn with the re-election of President Donald Trump in 2025. Under Trump's administration, a return to his America First trade policies seemed inevitable, with a focus on reducing trade deficits and reasserting U.S. economic interests. The steel and aluminum tariffs, which had been temporarily suspended under Biden, are expected to be reinstated under Trump's leadership. This change in policy is likely to have significant consequences for US-EU trade relations, particularly in industries like whiskey. One of the immediate consequences of Trump's re-election is the expected re-imposition of tariffs on US steel and aluminum imports, a move that will likely provoke retaliatory actions from the EU. Beginning April 1, 2025, the EU is expected to reinstate a 50% tariff on American whiskey, a sharp increase from the previous 25% tariff. Impact of the 50% tariff on whiskey exports. The 50% tariff will have severe implications for U.S. whiskey producers, particularly those in small and medium-sized distilleries. While larger distilleries with established market share may be able to absorb some of the tariff burden, smaller distilleries, which often have less financial flexibility, are likely to face considerable challenges. The increased cost of American whiskey due to the 50% tariff will likely reduce demand in the EU, making it harder for U.S. producers to compete with local European distillers or other international brands that don't face similar tariffs. For small and medium whiskey producers, the 50% tariff could threaten their market share in Europe, potentially driving them out of the market entirely or forcing them to significantly increase prices, which would lower their competitiveness. These distilleries could experience a sharp decline in exports, which would have ripple effects on their operations, employment, and local economies. For instance, regions such as Kentucky, where whiskey production is a major contributor to both employment and state revenue, could see significant economic losses if the tariffs are fully implemented. The effects of the tariff could be felt not only by distillers but also by corn farmers, transportation companies, and tourism businesses that rely on the whiskey industry. Political leverage and potential for escalating trade hostilities. The reinstatement of the 50% tariff on whiskey signals the return of trade hostilities between the US and the EU, raising uncertainty for US whiskey producers who rely on the European market. This move could be seen as a political leverage tool for President Trump in future trade negotiations, as he might use the threat of tariffs as a means to force EU concessions on broader issues, such as trade deficits or other economic policies. For the EU, the 50% tariff on whiskey could become a point of contention and could prompt retaliatory measures on other key US exports, including motorcycles, agricultural products, and machinery. Additionally, the EU might look for alternative markets or use other trade tools, such as regulatory measures or counter-tariffs on US products, to balance the growing tensions in the trade relationship. In response, U.S. whiskey producers and industry groups like the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, DISCUS, are likely to continue lobbying for the removal or reduction of tariffs. The EU's potential countermeasures could also involve trade talks focused on diplomatic resolutions and tariff reduction, especially if the 50% tariff leads to significant economic losses on both sides. Uncertainty and the future outlook for the whiskey industry. The whiskey industry's future outlook in the context of renewed trade tensions is fraught with uncertainty. The 50% tariff could lead to a period of heightened trade instability as U.S. producers scramble to adjust to new market conditions. Small distillers, in particular, may have difficulty maintaining their European market presence, while larger players may seek to diversify into other international markets or increase their domestic focus. Additionally, as trade tensions rise, the U.S. whiskey industry could face new challenges in other markets. The increasing unpredictability of US-EU trade relations, combined with potential retaliatory measures, makes it harder for businesses to plan and invest in their future growth. Without a stable and predictable trade environment, U.S. whiskey producers might face not only declining exports but also increased operational costs, both in terms of tariffs and logistical challenges associated with navigating global trade uncertainty. In conclusion, the reimposition of a 50% tariff on American whiskey signals a new phase of trade volatility between the U.S. and the EU. The Trump administration's trade policies, with an emphasis on tariffs, could exacerbate existing challenges for whiskey producers, particularly those in small and medium-sized distilleries. As the industry faces potential retaliatory measures and continued uncertainty in the broader trade landscape, U.S. whiskey producers will need to adapt to a new era of global trade instability, which may require increased diversification, domestic focus, and market repositioning to weather